This is the Big O Show. This is the Big O Show.
Big O, in your humble opinion, what is the greatest musical decade? I think it's the 70s. For me, I think the 60s, 70s, and 80s are the greatest musical eras, period. Okay? 90s comes right after. Forget about the 2000s and 2000s and whatever, the 10s. Those decades don't even come close. The 90s was pretty solid. But for me, the problem is that the 60s with the rock and the psychedelic, it was a new era at that time, right? And then 70s, you had the growth of heavy metal, the growth of electronic music, the growth of disco, the growth of punk, right? And then in the 80s, you had your new wave alternative coming in, right? You had freestyle that was kind of added on the back end of disco, right? And so you had hair metal, you had speed metal come in because obviously the Panteras and the Metallicas of the world and things like that grew from that. So there was a lot of innovation going on in each of those decades. And I can make an argument that the 60s, because of the influences coming from the Hendrix and the Beatles and everything else, I could easily make the argument that the 60s is the greatest decade ever. I can make an argument because of the turn that happened in the 70s, like I told you, from disco to punk to electronic music to classic rock and heavy metal, actually, because heavy metal kind of reared its ugly head, beautiful in my way, but reared its head like right at the end of the 60s with Sabbath, right? And then it really took off in the 70s. And then the 80s, again, more changes, so many influences in music, also from the 80s. I can make an argument for all three. So I got to kind of fence straddle and say all three were just as important. But if you put gun to head, I'm going to go 60s. Okay? Only because the pioneering that was going on in the 60s was sick. And it's the most important guys out there when we talk about Hendrix and we talk about the Beatles. You know what I'm saying? So it's just, Led Zeppelin came out right at the end. Stones, yeah, all that.
The Kinks.
Hell, didn't the Stones come out maybe in late 50s? No, right? Or maybe early 60s. But Beach Boys, Beach music also started in the 60s. So surf music, whatever, whatever
Stevie
it was called.
Wonder.
Stevie Wonder. I mean, it just
Motown. Just say Motown.
Well, but Motown
60s.
Actually started a little before that too. I could go 50s.
50s, yes.
But again, it's just 60s. I could go with the 60s, man. You know what I mean? But if somebody told me 70s and even 80s, we're kind of splitting hairs because there was so much growth in music in those 3 decades that I could understand anybody leaning there. But gun to head, I'll go 60s.
As far as influencing it, almost touches
just the great. No, he says the greatest decade. That's how he says it. So you can view it however you want to view it, because it's kind of open for interpretation. So it is subjective. That's why I say if anybody wants to say 70s or 80s, that's fine. You tell me 50s or 90s or anything else, we're having a fight. Okay? No, seriously. We're having an argument, and I'm going to crush you in that argument. I can't wait for anybody to tell me 50s or 2000s or whatever, or 90s. I love the 90s. I thought the 90s were actually really good, but the 90s they're not at the 60s, 70s, and 80s level. If you're young and that was your era, then you'll have a different feeling about it. But as a guy that's kind of lived through all these eras except for the 60s, but I was born in the 60s, but I didn't really live that era. I know it enough to know what the hell it meant to us. And so I would go 60s.